Before there was Ellen Ripley. Before there was Wonder Woman. There was the original action heroine, Atalanta. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. So here we are, the big finale, the 4-part conclusion of Knights of the Old Republic, the comic series. Here, writer John Jackson Miller, in tandem with interior artist Brian Ching and cover artist Benjamin Carré, bring the story of Zayn, Carrick, and friends to an end. And Miller finally resolves the last of the mysteries that he's been setting up since the beginning of the series. With so much to wrap up, Miller admitted in interviews that he resorted to using a storyboard and magnets created by his son to keep track of everything that he was trying to resolve in this final arc of the series. But enough with suspense. Demon begins on Coruscant, in the old Senate chamber, the place where decades ago, the Sith Lord Exar Kun fought and slew his former Jedi mentor Vodo Siosk Boss. Nowadays, the Senate conducts its official business elsewhere, but the old chamber is still used for grand ceremonial occasions, and in this case, a show trial. The show trial of the infamous Mandalorian mad scientist Demagal, who has finally woken up from his months-long drug-induced coma. Although it's pretty clear he's not all there in the head as he's being led towards the chamber, muttering babble that seems nonsensical to everyone else, but to some astute readers contains quite a bit of suggestive meaning. Having parted ways with Jarael and Roland, Zayn, Griff, Slisk, and LB are on Coruscant, mostly to testify at Demagal's trial. Partly because apparently Roland encouraged it, and partly at the request of Malik. Still, our young former Padawan can't help but feel that something's not quite right with this situation. But Griff couldn't care less about that. Apparently, the Snivian has just discovered that the money for their business, quote-unquote, the money that was supposed to be managed by Zayn's father, is missing from their account. He suspects that Zayn stole it behind his back, and is only slightly mollified when his partner admits that the money is being borrowed, but that he does intend to return it. Griff, of course, is still annoyed that Zayn never told him about this, at which point Zayn, after briefly falling for it for a second, responds by calling out both Griff and Slisk as to why they never told him how they escaped Sirocco, the little planet that got nuked by Mandalore the Ultimate back in Days of Fear. Griff initially tries to fob Zayn off, but then they walk past a pair of giant statues, one of the Snivian and one of the Trandoshan, and Griff decides that now is the time to finally come clean. Back on Sirocco, when the first air raid sirens went off, and the moment that Slisk realized that the little Bivoli no longer had enough fuel to make it out of the system, the Trandoshan basically panicked, grabbed Griff, and ran for the nearest troop transport. Apparently the flight crew was on sleep shift, and before the Republic troops packed aboard could stop him, Slisk made it to the cockpit and managed to take off right before the blasts hit. Thus, Slisk managed to save his hide along with Griff's, and about half a battalion of Republic troops. This landed the two of them a meeting with the Republic Ministry of Defense, and fortunately neither were recognized as fugitives. What's more, given the disastrous defeat at Sirocco, the Republic government was desperate to find a silver lining, and they decided to spin this unintended rescue of Republic troops into a propaganda narrative. And so was born Captain Benegriff Goodvalor, hero of Sirocco, and his trusty Trandoshan sidekick, star of holovids, toys, even propaganda broadcasts. Not to mention a highly lucrative interstellar restaurant chain. It seems that everybody on the hot prospect has been keeping secrets lately. Everyone except LB, that is. And when Zayn remarks that now with Jarael and Roland being gone, at least LB won't have to look at the guy that broke his hand, the normally silent loader droid responds, "That was not the Mandalorian that broke my hand." That Mandalorian looks like the one we have been traveling with, but they are not the same being. I lifted the Mandalorian that broke my hand into the camper special that day, and I lifted that container the next night once the Mandalorian you call Roland was hiding in it. That being weighed 17.4 kilos less. They are not the same being. I am a bulk loader. I may not know what many things are in your world, but I know what they weigh. The three organics are at first disbelieving, but as if the droid's words have opened a floodgate, they start remembering things. Little hints, little clues sprinkled carefully across this whole storyline by Miller. And then, like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle, everything falls horribly into place. And our heroes realize something that more astute readers may have already figured out some time ago. Roland isn't Roland, and he hasn't been for some time.
It's me, Austin!
Oh, son of a bitch!
What? It's me, Austin! It was me all along, Austin!
Damn, I cannot believe it.
You all bought it! You all bought it! Hook, line, and sinker!
It was all one big switcheroo perpetrated by Demagal. So, as if it weren't bad enough that Zayn has alienated Jerael, he's now left her alone in the company of an obsessive madman who until recently had a hobby of torturing Jedi in order to find out how the Force worked. Given Jerael's potential Force sensitivity, that makes the picture even grimmer. But even in this dark moment, KOTOR the comic is able to weave in a little dash of comedy. Griff asks LB why he never mentioned it before, and of course the loader droid simply says, "You didn't ask." Still, if our heroes want to save Jerael, they gotta act fast. But before they can do that, there's someone else whose life they need to save. Cut to the Senate chamber where Malak is testifying, read ranting, about the Mandalorians in general and about Demagal in particular. The man that we now know is the real Roland Dyer, sick and tired of being mistaken for a sadistic psycho that he isn't, actually manages to break his restraints and tries to attack the Jedi. But the Mandalorian is still unsteady on his feet, and Malak easily throws him across the chamber with the Force. As the crowd bays for his blood, the Mandalorian, defiant even in his relative helplessness, delivers yet another of those classic Miller lines of dialogue. A line that many a KOTOR gamer must have smiled at when they read this for the first time. "This is your secret, isn't it? You can't beat us in a fair fight. That's the way you like it, Jedi, isn't it? So save your Republic. But who will save the Republic from you?" As the mood of the crowd gets even uglier, Republic security is forced to remove Demagal from the old Senate chamber lest he be torn apart before he can be properly sentenced. He's quickly hustled out and into a hover car, and finally manages to remove Demagal's helmet as they take off, only to discover that his prison escorts are Zayn Carrick and Marn Hieroglyph, pulling off their biggest con yet. Meanwhile, Jerael is once again seemingly lost and without purpose. Now that it's just her and Roland, there's no chance of doing damage to the Crucible now. She's lost Zayn just like she lost Camper, just like she lost her old life, with a mentor that she names Wirrick before the Crucible came and took her away. She's not exactly riding high here. Luckily, perhaps, Roland suggests that there may still be a chance to strike at the Crucible, at least in some small way. Apparently Zayn had told him about his conversations with Chantique. Back when she'd been manipulating Zayn to turn against Jerael, she had mentioned that she and Jerael had belonged to the same school facility, along with a bunch of other students. She'd also mentioned that she knew where those students were, and that they were someplace ironic. Roland thinks that if Jerael's former classmates yet live, there may still be a chance to save them. The question is, where would they be? Where would the Crucible consider ironic? It turns out that place is Osadia, the same planet where the Crucible stole Jerael and the other students from. Ironic indeed. The planet's location doesn't exist on any chart, but Roland knows where it is. Jerael is obviously confused as to how he could possibly know that, and that's when the man that everyone thought was Roland Dyer up to this point removes his helmet for the first time since Flashpoint and reveals his true identity as Antos Wirek, Jarael's former mentor and the former head of the school on Osadia. Wirek says that he failed to protect Jarael and the students before, but now that he's found her, he is determined to find the others and save them from the Crucible. He claims that after the students were all stolen by them, he wandered the galaxy aimlessly, joining the Mandalorians later on in the hopes that maybe it would grant him some purpose and peace of mind. When Jarael asks the obvious question why he never revealed himself to her, he spins a sob story about fearing that she might reject him or simply not forgive him for failing to protect her and the other students from the Crucible. Though she does unintentionally nearly catch him out when she asks if the reason for his constant running away from every battle he was in was that he was looking for her and the others. After all, he had been known as Roland the Runner. Though of course the real Roland had been doing so because he was looking for answers as to why the Mandalorian Wars had started at all. When she asks that question, Wirek basically goes through a, yes, exactly, that's why moment. Luckily, awkward question time comes to an end when the ship they rented arrives out of hyperspace over Osadia, and the pair have to focus on planning how they're going to break into the old facility and rescue the former students. Back on Coruscant, Malak is spearheading a manhunt for Demagol after he mysteriously escaped from Republic security. While that's going on, Zayn, Griff, and the real Roland Dyer are hiding out in an old garage that Zayn recently purchased with some of that money they got from the Metellus exchange. And once Roland has finally vented his anger over being mistaken for Demagol for months, he's finally calm enough to provide some exposition as to who Demagol really is and where he really came from. Roland happens to know this because when he was originally looking for answers, he started by trying to investigate people like Demagol and Cassis Fett, people that Mandalore the Ultimate had promoted and supported despite having qualities that are considerably un-Mandalorian. Antos Wirek was a Zeltron, although rather than being born and raised on Zeltros, their homeworld, he was instead raised by a particularly nasty and obscure Star Wars race known as the Iskaloni. Think the Borg, only more isolationist and a lot less interested in assimilating everybody. Apart from this reference in KOTOR the comic, they're only ever really mentioned in the second edition of the West End Star Wars RPG. The thing about the Iskaloni, though, is that they do like to perform experiments on people. Really sick, unnatural experiments. In order to survive among these strange, inhuman masters, Antos Wirek offered his services as an assistant in their experiments. The thing about Zeltrons is that they are natural empaths, much like the Betazoids from Star Trek, skilled at reading the emotions of others, as well as having the ability to project their own emotions. But of course, growing up among the Iskaloni, these abilities were rather stunted in young Wirek, as well as anything resembling empathy. Young Wirek's servitude came to an end when the Mandalorians, shortly before the Sith War, decided to attack the Iskaloni and devastated their holdings, freeing many of their slaves in the process, including the young Zeltron. Mind you, this is before the Neo-Crusader reforms, so Wirek didn't so much join the Mandalorians as serve them. And so he was present that fateful day on Kuar when Mandalore the Indomitable was defeated in single combat by Ulic Qel-Droma. The sight of the greatest warrior of the Mandalorians humbled aroused curiosity in the young Zeltron. What was the power of this Jedi that he could defeat the Indomitable? And could that power be understood? In the attempt to discover the answers to these questions, Wirek even went so far as to sneak into Ulic Qel-Droma's own chambers, and there he discovered a robe. Having learned something of genetics from the Iskalani, and since Ulic always kept this with him, Wirek decided to take it, thinking that there might be some genetic trace on it that could lead him to the answers he sought. Of course, the Sith War came to an end, and the Mandalorians were broken for a time. So Wirek simply left their ranks and went over to the Republic. He managed to enroll at a university on Arcania, and was making some progress with his studies until pureblood families like the Adaskas began expelling all non-humans, as well as the Arcanian offshoots, from the universities. Despite being increasingly ostracized by the purebloods, Wirek and his offshoot colleagues were able to continue their studies, albeit in a more limited capacity. But at last, Wirek was able to identify the genetic traces clinging to the robe he had taken from Keldroma. But it did not belong to Ulik himself, but rather his dead mentor, the Arcanian master Arca Jeth. Doubtless, Ulik had kept his beloved teacher's robe as a sort of memento. Antos Wirek had managed to make some progress, but by now his resources and those of his offshoot colleagues were all but exhausted. And so he went back to the Mandalorians and offered his services and those of the offshoot scientists. With the genetic material of one of the greatest Jedi Knights of that time, Wirek proposed that if the power of the Jedi could be understood, it could be made to serve the Mandalorians. The offshoot scientists, embittered by the racist treatment they'd received from the purebloods, were willing to work with the Mandalorians if it meant access to resources again, and the Mandalorians, by this point dominated by the Neo-Crusaders, were willing to embrace unconventional means if it meant victory against the Jedi. And so, with new Mandalorian backing, Wirek and the offshoots set up a genetics lab/training facility on the remote world of Osadia. There, they would use Arca Jeth's DNA to try and create an army of Force sensitives that could serve the Mandalorian cause. They originally tried cloning, but for reasons that are never described, that proved to be a bust. And so they settled for the next best thing, modifying embryos by splicing bits of Arca Jeth's DNA into their makeup in vitro. Initially, this too proved unsuccessful until Wirek realized what was the problem. They had been working on a false assumption. The false assumption that Arca Jeth was a pure-blood Arcanian. He wasn't. In his genetic makeup was the ancestry of another alien race known as the Sephi. Earlier in Arca Jeth's life, this had been distinguished by the fact that he had pointed ears, something that pure Arcanians don't have. However, prior to the Sith War, Arca Jeth was disfigured in a fire, and when the Arcanian surgeons put him back together, they neglected to give his ears their old points. And later on, families like the Adaskas chose to scrub all reference to Arca Jeth's mixed heritage from the records. After all, it wouldn't do for this great paragon of the Arcanian race to be anything other than a pureblood. Unfortunately, it was exactly because of Arca Jeth's mixed genetic heritage that there were problems with the in vitro modification, and Wirek soon discovered that there was only one way to bypass this: by splicing Arca Jeth's DNA with the malleable genetic code of the Arcanian offshoots. Which made sense, after all. The offshoots had originally been created by the Arcanian race to be adaptable and resilient mine laborers. There were several married couples among the offshoot scientists, and eventually they agreed to the idea of conceiving children that would be genetically modified with Arca Jeth's DNA. Wirek simply saw this as a way to further his research. For the offshoots, it was that and also a chance to stick it to the purebloods. They, who had been scorned as an inferior race, would now give birth to a whole new kind of Arcanian Ubermensch. The fact that each and every child would contain the blood of Arcania's greatest hero flowing in their veins would make that revenge all the sweeter. At last, the Mandalorian Knight Project began to see success with the birth of the first stable child carrying the DNA of Arca Jeth, a little girl named Edessa, the Triumph in Arcanian. We of course know her as Jerael. She was only the first. Soon, there were many children at the Osadia facility, all of them offshoots, all of them carrying a trace of Arca Jeth's DNA. Even so, these children were too few for what Wirek had in mind, hardly enough to create an army. And so he began making deals with slaver groups like the Crucible, paying them to capture and deliver to Osadia fertile offshoot couples that could produce ever more children for his project. Unfortunately, Wirek failed to take into account the fact that slavers are a greedy lot. And so, one fateful day, when he and his fellow scientists returned to Osadia after making a progress report to Mandalore the Ultimate, they discovered that the Crucible had raided the education facility and taken all of the children. It didn't take long for the Arcanian offshoot scientists, who had now lost their own children, to discover that Wirek had been the one who had brought the slavers to Osadia in the first place, and so they turned their backs on him. Alone and with his Mandalorian Knight Project in tatters, Wirek returned to the service of Mandalore the Ultimate, an even colder man than before. With his former facilities destroyed by the Crucible, he had to resort to cruder means in order to carry out his research of the Force. hence his torturous experiments on Jedi at Flashpoint, and why all the other Mandalorians, in disgust, began to call him Demaragal, the Flesh Carver, a name shortened to Demagal. All this Roland Dyer had learned over the course of months of investigations, always running off to hunt for secrets after the battle was won, including discovering and even interviewing the Arcanian offshoot scientists who had been Wirrick's former colleagues. By the time Roland met Zayn and Griff on Vanquo, he'd discovered all he needed to know about Demagal and was beginning to turn his attention to Cassus Fett. Still, he was more than willing to help Zayn put one over on Demagal. And when he stripped the latter's armor so that Zayn could use it as a disguise, Roland was able to confirm for himself that Demagal and Antos Wirrick the Zeltron were indeed one and the same. Unfortunately, when Roland went to retrieve Demagal after the events of Flashpoint, he made the twin mistakes of underestimating his enemy and going near him without a helmet. Demagal managed to get the drop on him and sent him into a drugged stupor. The last thing Roland had heard before slipping into unconsciousness was Demagal's ranting about Jerael. If we recall, Jerael had been kidnapped on Vanquo by the Mandalorians because she had been disguised as a Jedi, and thus had been delivered to Flashpoint for Demagal to experiment on her. Demagal had of course recognized Jerael by her pointed ears, irrefutable proof of her genetic connection to Arca Jeth. If one of the offshoot children from Osadia was still alive, maybe the others were. Maybe his original Mandalorian Night project could still be salvaged. He had to go with Jerael, and in order to do this, he switched armor with Roland Dyer. Of course, this explains the real reason why he never took off his helmet, not the sob story excuse he gave to Jerael earlier. He had no way of knowing if any of Jerael's companions aboard the Last Prospect had ever seen Roland without his helmet, so there was no way he could take it off and risk exposing his falsehood. It did help things that Zayn, Griff, and Camper had only known Roland very briefly, so his change in demeanor post-Flashpoint would have been less noticeable to them. Roland's big exposition dump causes Zayn to have an epiphany of his own. Chantique is a Zeltron, and she was taken from the same place as Jerael by the Crucible. Roland confirms that there was a female Zeltron attached to Wirrick's original project, that she had a daughter and then committed suicide after said daughter disappeared. And so the last piece falls into place. Chantique is Demagal's daughter, and he sold her to the Crucible because being a Zeltron and not an Arcanian offshoot, Arca Jeth's DNA didn't take with her own code, and so he got rid of her, having written her off as a failure. If Roland didn't already despise Demagal, he certainly does now, as he points out that children are sacred to the Mandalorians. Well, unless you're Cassus Fett and they are Cathar children. But we're not yet done with Revelations just yet. Our trio is rejoined by Slisk, who has gone back to the Hot Prospect to recover Roland's armor from dueling ambitions, and are also joined by Shel Jelavan, at which point Zayn makes his own big reveal. That money that Griff had noticed missing from his and Zayn's business account, the account overseen by Zayn's father, well, it turns out that that money was being used for this, a semi-secret mercy mission operation created by Zayn, Shel, the remnants of the Taris Resistance, and the families of the other dead Padawans. Their mission? To help the little people who are overlooked by the Republic and the Jedi during the course of the war. Orphans, refugees, the wrongly accused, and so on. Funded by the money the crew of the Hot Prospect had made in their recent scams. And of course, it's named the Rogue Moon Project. These are Zayn's mysterious resources, the ones that he called upon in the initial attempts to take down the Crucible. And now, with this plus the name Osadia, they can hopefully track down Jerael and Demagal before it's too late. Brief pause, but there's a nice little touch here where Shel gives back Zayn's lightsaber, which apparently has recently been modified to incorporate the crystals from the sabers of the other 4 Taris Padawans, including Shel's brother. It even has their names engraved on the hilt as a tribute, which is nice. But speaking of lightsabers, the sight of Zayn's jogs a memory in Slisk's head, and the Trandoshan hands to the young former Padawan a little microtag with some strange-sounding information on it. Remember how back in Exalted, the Mumo brothers had swiped a bunch of Sith artifacts encased in a weird force-dampening gunk from Audran? Well, it turns out Demigol, as Roland, swiped one for himself on the sly, and the artifact in question just happens to be the double-bladed lightsaber of Exar Kun, Dark Lord of the Sith. As if things weren't bad enough, if Jerael is indeed Force-sensitive, as Demigol evidently believes, then exposure to an artifact so steeped in evil as one of Exar Kun's possessions could very well turn her to the dark side. The problem is, our heroes may know Osadia's name, but they don't know its location, and without it, there's no way they can help Jerael. And then, Zayn has an epiphany. Dace Galliard, the Crucible captain that captured Jerael in the first place. The man usually put in charge of the actual Crucible slave raids. He will know where Osadia is. And if they're going to catch him, they're going to need some help. From the Republic, the Revankists, and the Mandalorians. Recall how at the end of Vector, Cassis Fett told Zayn that he owed him for warning him about the Rakghoul plague on Jebel? Well, now the time has come to cash in on that favor. First, with Roland as intermediary, Zayn convinces Cassis to take a Mandalorian strike force deep into Republic space, and more importantly, to not be very subtle about doing so. Next, through Shell, Zayn drops an anonymous tip at the Republic Ministry of Defense, convincing them to send a fleet under Admiral Karath to counter the Mandalorian incursion. Of course, this is all just a giant piece of bait to lure out Galliard and the Gladiator. Galliard being the consummate scavenger, Zayn is banking on him catching wind of this upcoming battle and then hiding nearby in the system, waiting until both sides have bloodied each other so that he can swoop in and snap up any survivors, either in life pods or from those ships too damaged to limp away to a repair dock. For once, Zayn's plan works like a charm, without a single hiccup or thing going wrong. Cassis and the Mandalorians bug out to hyperspace right before the Republic fleet can engage them. Zayn confirms that the Gladiator is indeed in the vicinity and contacts Karath, informing him of the ship and of its captain, Dace Galliard. Thanks to the Rogue Moon project, Zayn has learned that there's something of a history between Karath and Galliard. Remember how it was established back in the Reaping that Galliard used to be a Navy officer? Well, it turns out that he left the fleet by essentially deserting his post during a battle in the Sith War, abandoning a lot of people to their deaths, including Saul Karath's father. Of course, Karath and the Republic fleet easily capture the Gladiator. Galliard attempts to escape to a nearby asteroid, only for the Gladiator's prize crew to send his own Skyreaper drones to round him up. Fitting. Cassis Fett confirms via comlink that the feint was a success, thus confirming that his debt to Zayn is repaid. He wishes them luck in hunting down and killing Demigol before he departs. Apparently, even as ruthless and genocidal as he is, Cassis Fett has some degree of standards. With Galliard and the Gladiator captured, Zayn and company swiftly learn of Osadia's location from the ship's databanks. Unfortunately, Galliard reveals under questioning that Chantique had a force vision that Jerael and Demigol would go to Osadia, and is even now awaiting them in the old school facility with Baranjar and some of the Crucible's best fighters. At this rate, there's no way that the hot prospect can reach Osadia before Jerael walks into the Crucible's trap. In order to solve this problem, Zayn gently strong-arms Karath into providing a fast ship for him and his friends. Mostly by reminding the good admiral of all the things Zayn did for him and which Karath got the credit for. And so Karath acquiesces, albeit with bad grace. It turns out that the fastest ship in Karath's fleet is the Testament, a fast cruiser belonging to Captain Teleto, a friend and associate of the Revankists. In fact, we met him briefly in Masks. From him we learn that while the Revankists have gained some acceptance, they're mostly still in the doghouse with the High Council. Luckily, the Republic Admiralty has a precedent of deputizing Mercy Corps to serve as support, a precedent that's at least as old as the Sith War. And so Revan was able to work around the High Council's disapproval by organizing the Revankists into a volunteer Mercy Corps, albeit one that's more interested in wielding lightsabers against the Mandalorians than healing injured victims. More importantly, once Griff and Zayn are alone, the Snivian reveals that something's been bothering him lately, ever since he learned that Demigol had been hiding amongst them since Flashpoint. Funny how things conveniently seem to happen involving Zayn Carrick, both for better and for worse. And it seems to happen every time Zayn uses the Force to accomplish a significant goal, faking the Mandalorian invasion on Vanquo only for the real invasion to come shortly after, freeing the Jedi prisoners from Flashpoint only for Demagol to sneak aboard the Last Resort disguised as Roland, sneaking into the Dre estate only to run into Hazen and his plan to take over the Jedi Order. As Griff puts it, the fix is in. The only questions are, what kind of fix is this, and exactly what has Zayn been doing to cause it? And here at last we finally get the revelation of Zayn's unique ability, that thing that Hazen hinted at as far back as Flashpoint. Apparently, Miller's inspiration for this idea was watching his own children grow up and become accustomed to the world around him, which caused him to think about how the Force might affect probability. As Miller describes it, Zayn exists at a kind of right angle to the Force. Every time he tries to use it to affect an outcome, he doesn't have a grasp on it the way that other Jedi do. Where another Jedi would simply, say, lift a wine glass with the Force, Zayn attempting the same thing would rather cause it to wobble back and forth. It might steady itself or it might spill over. Essentially, it's as if by drawing upon his powers, Zayn creates uncertainties and disturbances within the Force, causing both positive and negative outcomes to spin out of that disturbance. Zayn is more than a little depressed by this understanding of his own relationship to the Force, because it means that he can never really use it to do good without also causing something bad to happen. Unexpected reversals, collateral damage, and pure destructive chaos will dog him for all his life. Not exactly an enviable fate. At least it helps explain how Zayn survived that ridiculous fall back at the beginning of the series on Taris. To paraphrase the man himself, the Force doesn't want him happy, but it doesn't want him dead. Still, it does mean that he'll always be causing problems for others, such as how he alienated Jerael at the end of Destroyer, which is of course the very reason why she's now in danger in the first place. It's then that Griff surprises Zayn and the audience by giving his partner, of all things, an inspiring pep talk. And possibly this may be Griff's best monologue yet. You can tell Miller really liked this character. They thought it was a disability. Just goes to show that Jedi don't play cards. What kind of teachers don't play cards? In Pazak, it's not the swings that break you, it's how you bet during them. But you know they're coming, and if you can see them, you can play them. Don't you get it? For you, the galaxy's a fair game. Things might look bad, but in the end, everything balances out for you. And if you know that, you can use that, my young apprentice. And you just have to love that comic panel equivalent of a comedy beat before Zayn says, "I am not calling you master." Meanwhile, Demagol and Jerael have begun their assault on the Crucible forces occupying the old school. The latter clad in body armor and wielding the lightsaber of Exar Kun, although she doesn't know that last detail just yet. Between the two of them, they actually make a pretty clean sweep of it, with Demagol personally killing the Magister Protector Baranjar himself. While the scientist is still desperately looking for the rest of his children, Jerael has a run-in with Chantique. Chantique being her usual sadistic self, she begins by taunting Jerael about how she was able to turn Zayn against her, even going so far as to throw Jerael's own words back at her, the ones that she'd said to Zayn after he'd surrendered himself to the Covenant back in Commencement in order to save her, Griff, and Camper from being hunted down along with him. But he sacrificed himself for me once. Once was enough. Can't let him go around thinking that's sensible behavior. And then she really mashes Jerael's berserk button by saying that after Chantique has killed her, she'll take Zayn back to the Crucible and stick him in the fighting pits. And I don't know about you, but that gave me some serious Return of the Jedi flashbacks.
If you will not turn to the dark side, then perhaps she will.
The fight is short and surprisingly one-sided. Chantique's grasp of the Force is rudimentary at best, given that she had no formal training, while Jerael has had a lifetime of martial arts training, as well as the fact that she might be getting a boost by holding the lightsaber of Exar Kun, with of course the attendant risk that holding the artifact, as well as boosting her power, may also be fanning her negative emotions, driving her towards the dark side. For a moment, it looks like Jarael finally has her hated tormentor literally dead to rights, and then in comes Zayn Carrick and Roland Dyer. Time being of the essence, the pair fly in on the Mandalorian's jetpack, and in another echo of commencement, Zayn crashes through the roof of the school the same way Jarael crashed through the roof of the Jedi Temple on Terrace. The fact that Zayn actually came back for Jarael seems to offend Chantique more than surprise her. But she soon has other things on her mind when Zayn reveals that Antos Wirrick, the father that sold her to the Crucible in the first place, is here. As for Demagol, he runs into Roland while searching for his other students and very nearly gets the crap beaten out of him by the angry Mandalorian, who proceeds to strip off the armor that he used to disguise himself. Suddenly, though, Demagol somehow manages to throw Roland against the wall, knocking him out. Almost as if, nah, couldn't be. Zayn and an injured Jarael try to escape, while Zayn hurriedly brings her up to speed on what's been going on, only to be brought up short when Jarael reveals that she felt no evil influence from Exar Kun's lightsaber, even though Zayn could feel its malevolent influence from well outside the building. Here there's admittedly a bit of weak writing. Mostly because things are moving so fast, it looks like Chantique ran off to find Demagol, then almost immediately came back to attack Zayn and Jarael again, with only the brief confrontation between Roland and Demagol to serve as an interlude. It almost gives the impression that Chantique ran off, then decided to just come back almost immediately. Anyway, Chantique is back, she's got Exar Kun's lightsaber and disarmed Zayn, and it looks like she's got our two heroes at her mercy. Luckily, Chantique was never really well educated on how to use her force abilities. If she were, she most definitely would have sensed Demagol coming up behind her before he stabbed her in the back with a knife. Demagol then shows off just what a great father he was by demanding where the children are, to which Chantique replies that she is his child, even giving her birth name, Kasara. But of course, Demagol doesn't care about that. He wants the good children, the ones that worked, because all that ever mattered to him was his Mandalorian Night project, and by those metrics, Chantique was nothing but a failure. The injured Magister Impressor says that they're in the schoolyard, and everybody troops out to that spot, only to find no one's there. But lest we forget, Chantique never said that the other students from Osadia were safe. She only said they were someplace ironic. And when she said they were in the schoolyard, she meant they were in the schoolyard. Chantique is a sadist. When she makes an enemy, she wants to make them suffer before she kills them. It's why she decided to turn Zayn against Jarael back in Destroyer. Of course, she didn't know where her father was or that he was even still alive until now, but since all the other offshoot students belonged to the Crucible, she decided that she could still exact some measure of revenge on the father who had abandoned her by destroying his life's work utterly. After she returned to the Crucible and became Magister Impressor, once every standard year, she would take one of the Osadian offshoot students back to the old academy on Osadia and buried them alive in the schoolyard. She would have kept this up for years more, but when she received that force vision that Jarael was coming to Osadia, most likely to save her fellow students, she brought the remainder here and killed them all en masse. Demagol being Demagol, he starts mentally scrambling for some way to try and save his project. After all, Jarael is still alive, and she carries Arca-Jeth's DNA, only for Zayn to crush that last hope too. The fact that Jarael felt no evil influence from holding Exar Kun's lightsaber is the ultimate proof. Whatever her combat abilities or even her relationship with the Force, Jarael is no Force sensitive. Demagol refuses to accept this, of course, bringing up the example on Metelos 3 when... Did Jarael break the chain in that solar chamber? Or did he break it? And then a recovered Roland emerges to deliver the final revelation, because it's the only one that makes sense. Jarael isn't Force sensitive, but Demagol is. It had been Demagol that had used the Force to break the chain on Metelos 3, just as he had used it just now to throw Roland across the room. He had possessed the power that had so fascinated him his entire life, and yet he was so obsessed with finding the Force in others that he completely failed to see it in his own flesh and blood, both literally and metaphorically.
Ironic.
Understatement of the decade, Palpatine. Chantique pulls the knife from her back and leaps to kill her father. Demigol, reacting on instinct, uses the Force to call both Zayn and Exar Kun's lightsabers to him to defend himself, but whether by luck or by Zayn's weird effect on the Force, it's Exar Kun's lightsaber he grabs, and remember, Kun was the first guy to have a lightsaber with 2 blades. And thus perish father and daughter in a macabre embrace, and the madness is finally over. The Crucible is never really mentioned again after this, and it's kind of assumed in a headcanon kind of way that with its leaders dead, the organization fell into disarray and finally faded from existence. Although Miller does reference it a little in the Knight Errant series, suggesting that other Sith Lords used the Crucible system as a model for training their own non-Force sensitive troops in millennia to come. We rejoin our heroes a few days later on Coruscant. Zayn and Roland have taken Jarael to a certain apartment building. Zayn is explaining that he's returned Exar Kun's lightsaber to the custody of the Jedi, and he also takes the opportunity to make a formal apology to Jarael for their blow-up back on Vulgax. And again, Miller's dialogue is so good that I really can't explain it any better than he does himself. I did exactly what you were afraid everyone else would do. What I saw with the Crucible was bad, but it should never have shaken my faith in you. Of all people, I should know better. When you grow up never being good enough, every day's a compromise between what you want to be and what you are. I know what you wanted to be for those people, and that's what's important. But Zayn didn't bring Jarael here just to apologize. Recall that when Roland was looking for information on Demigol, he ended up tracking down and even interviewing the Arcanian offshoot scientists that had initially worked with him on the Mandalorian Night Project. Using that information, and wishing to commemorate the anniversary of their first meeting in that terrace junkyard, which will be tomorrow, Zayn reintroduces Jarael to her parents. Of course, Roland Dyer immediately disappears after that, returning to his quest for answers, and Zayn leaves Jarael and her family to be reacquainted with one another. And so the story of Knights of the Old Republic the comic concludes the following evening at Good Valor's Little Bivoli, as Zayn and Griff prepare to part ways. Oh, not completely, they'll still see each other often, but they're no longer going to be business partners. Griff and Slisk are making plenty of bank off of the Little Bivoli restaurant chain, but that doesn't mean that our favorite mastermind has gone completely legit. Lots of people want to visit a restaurant patronized by the great hero of Sirocco, including a lot of important and well-connected people on Coruscant. And every table is wired, allowing Griff to listen in on any, under-the-table arrangements for his own benefit. As for Zayn, he doesn't know exactly what he's going to do with himself now, but there are plenty of opportunities for him, not to mention choices. There's the Rogue Moon project, the Jedi Order are apparently willing to ask him to help train people with similar issues with the Force to himself. Maybe he'll decide to contribute to the war effort against the Mandalorians. Hell, with his new Gothar Special swoop bike, maybe he'll hit the swoop dueling circuit and go pro. A clear indication that although Miller was prepared to end the story here, he's also leaving an opening to come back and tell further adventures of Zayn Carrick. As ever, Miller gives Griff some of the best lines in the series, and it is only appropriate that the last line of dialogue that I quote belong to the Snivian. You humans, you keep trying to choose who to be, but why stop at one choice? You can be everybody, and if you don't know how to be someone, you can fake it. Wise words. He does manage to convince Zayn to help wait tables tonight, particularly the customer at table 17 who has a question for him. Zayn grudgingly goes along with it, only to find that the customer at table 17 is Jarael, in a fetching evening gown no less. She'll be staying on Coruscant so that she can get to know her family again, but she's also going to have plenty of free time as well. And as to that question Griff said she had, well, is Zayn the kind of Jedi who rejects emotional attachments, or not? Translation, are you fine with us repairing our friendship, or are you perhaps willing to move on to something more? Well, that's a definitive answer if I've ever seen one. And thus ends Knights of the Old Republic, the comic book. Okay, first off, I am never doing this again. Next time I encounter a comic series or book series that's really long, I am spacing it out. Thank you very much. Second, I absolutely loved this comic and definitely giving it a canon verdict. Though the narrative does have the occasional bit of weak writing and the consistency of the art varies a little too much for my liking, The overall story is solid and the characters are brilliantly written. Naturally, the main core of the story this whole time has been Zayn and Jerael, although admittedly the latter didn't get much focus until after Vindication. What makes Zayn work as a protagonist, in my opinion, is his ability to combine both optimism and relatability at the same time. Let's be honest, the vast majority of Star Wars Jedi protagonists are either chosen ones with natural talent or experienced incompetent knights. The fact that he's below average at best automatically makes Zayn more relatable to the average reader as a protagonist, because let's face it, mediocrity is common, talent is rare. Optimism, of course, is in keeping with the theme of Star Wars, of the hero persevering in the face of adversity. The problem is that all too often in stories like this, optimistic protagonists fail because they aren't allowed to let adversity bother them. This makes them come off as saccharine and annoying. And of course, if they don't feel the stress of the situation they're in, why should the audience? That Zayn is able to go through the crappy experiences while also not giving in to despair becomes inspiring where otherwise it would have been annoying, though he does come pretty damn close in the end of Destroyer. Amusingly, as an added bonus, his weird relationship with the Force works in a meta sense as well as in-universe. Essentially, Zayn has the best superpower of any Star Wars protagonist, the power to keep being the protagonist. He keeps getting into trouble, and yet he always manages to dig his way out. Jerael's character arc doesn't really kick in until the Crucible part of the story, so a lot of her appeal initially comes from the mysteries that are raised surrounding her origins. Otherwise, her arc is more of the standard learning to open up about her past and place her trust in others. Though admittedly, Miller does something a little more interesting than usual by actually having that trust betrayed when Shantique manages to briefly turn Zayn against her in Destroyer. Of course, their relationship is ultimately repaired by series end, but still, not many series would even go that far. Most stories would have that trust remain unwaveringly intact throughout. Of course, Griff excels as both brains of the outfit and comic relief. And if he isn't already, he certainly deserves to be a fan favorite. But good heroes are only half the equation. The other half is excellent villains. With the Covenant, Miller somehow achieved the Herculean task of combining relatable villains with pure evil mustache-twirling ones. What with the Covenant being motivated by the desire to prevent another Sith war, only to find out that they've been puppeteered by a would-be Sith Lord from the shadows this whole time. The fact that Hazen's own background in many ways mirrors that of Zayn adds an extra interesting wrinkle to his character, showing how very easily Zayn could have gone down a similar path had his own morals not been so high. With the Crucible, we got a look into the dark heart of slavery, and with Shantique essentially serving as the representative of the faction, the kind of cruelty and sadism that makes such a thing possible. For his part, Demagol plays the role of the obsessive mad scientist well, and especially once his backstory and motivations are revealed, he makes for a menacing final boss, although a lot less overtly threatening than the other villains. That said, while his mystery and eventual reveal is well executed, Miller does leave just a few too many breadcrumbs for astute readers to pick up on. Even in my first read-through, where I went in completely blind, I knew as early as Days of Fear that Roland Dyer wasn't who he said he was. And given his sudden extensive medical knowledge, there was really only one person he could have been. Even considering the fact that I never really got into Star Wars comics until recently, I am amazed that I never heard of this before. When I heard of famous Star Wars comics, it was usually either Tales of the Jedi or Dark Empire. For my money, though, this should be the comic that everyone points to when they say best Star Wars comic ever written, and I declare John Jackson Miller thus far the best comic book story writer in the entirety of Star Wars. As promised, every mystery has been answered, every setup has been paid off. While To the Last Man will always be a personal favorite of mine, I can say without hyperbole that Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, the comic, is the best comic series in this franchise. And with that, we go our separate ways for a while. The KOTOR special will return and conclude, fittingly, in the month of May. First, with one more short comic by Miller, and finally, the main event that you've all been waiting for, Knights of the Old Republic, the video games 1 and 2. Until then.